I do think that ultimately over time, the dollar is going to lose this reserve status, and then trade with China is going to collapse on its own because the dollar is going to collapse and Americans aren't going to be able to afford all of these Chinese products. If people want Chinese products. How do they get them? Well, they have to export something. You know, they export food and they can import these products. But I agree with you. We're not likely to get to a situation where, you know, this happens by government decree. But I do think that ultimately over time, the dollar is going to lose this reserve status, and then trade with China is going to collapse on its own because the dollar is going to collapse and Americans aren't going to be able to afford all of these Chinese products. So the Chinese will either trade with other people who can afford to pay for their products with other products, or the Chinese people will just start consuming a lot more on their own, which is going to be great for them. You know, they'll have higher standards of living. But if the Chinese produce goods that the world wants to buy, and they say that you need to pay yuan for these goods, not dollars, to the extent that people want those products, they're going to need yuan to pay for them. I mean, that's where the demand comes from. It's the productive capacity of the nation. And if you need that currency because you need their products, well, then you need the currency. I mean, right now, the main demand for the dollar is not for our products, not that we don't have any products, but our biggest product is our debt. And so people want dollars to buy treasuries. You know, God knows why, but that's what they do. That's what they do with them. Or they buy, you know, other financial assets, or maybe they buy U.S. stocks.
Or they service their U.S. dollar debt. That's the biggest driver.
Yeah, although one day their U.S. dollar debt is just going to be repudiated, you know, with inflation. So that's the least of their worries long term, because the U.S. government is the biggest U.S. dollar debtor. You know, we got a $31.5 trillion debt, and it's unpayable. And so the only viable political way forward is to inflate that debt away. Well, when the U.S. government inflates its debt away, it inflates away everybody's debt. You know,
how does China inflate away their 300% total debt to GDP? How do they get out from underneath that big debt burden?
Well, it's not. You're talking about all the debt. It's not
if you look at all the assets in the banking system compared to their GDP,
but you're not talking about, that's not government debt. You're talking about like
no, but that's corporate debt. But isn't corporate debt important?
I'm not talking about our corporate debt. We got corporate debt. We got municipal debt. We got tons of debt. We got more debt than anybody. But you know, obviously, look, the Chinese economy has some problems, and there's going to be defaults. There's going to be bankruptcies. I mean, the whole world's kind of screwed up because it's been on this U.S. dollar reserve system. We haven't had real money since 1971, so we got 50 years of funny money and central planning when it comes to interest rates, and and so the whole world is screwed up. I'm not saying that it's paradise over there in China, but I'm just talking about on a relative basis, which country is the most screwed up. And I would say that our economy is more screwed up because we have been the primary beneficiary of this monetary system. And so our economy has evolved with that crutch, with the crutch of not having to produce, and not having to save. And so it's not going to, we're not going to be able to turn on a light switch and reprogram everybody in America and give them the bad news that, hey, it's time to go back to work. Everybody has just been conditioned to think that, well, the Fed can fix every problem. We'll just print some money, right? I mean, everybody looks to government. Look at the State of the Union address that we just had. It's all about all this great stuff that the government's going to do. Nobody talks about capitalism or freedom. Everybody expects the government to hand them everything on a silver platter. Well, so far the government's been handing them the stuff that the Chinese have been putting on that platter. When the platter's empty, I mean, it's going to be a rude awakening.
Well, I listen, I agree with that. The whole world is in for a rude awakening.
Look, it's a good thing that we're blessed with natural resources. Imagine if we were like Japan or something. I mean, we couldn't even survive if we were in their situation. So it's a good thing we've got those things. But I think if you actually think about it and you look at the relationship that America has with China, and you just look at what we sell them and what they sell us, and if you didn't know anything, if you were just like on another planet and you said, hey, here's these two countries, one of them grows shit and takes stuff out of the ground, raw materials, and sends it to this other country, which sends back all these manufactured finished goods and stuff like that. I mean, China would look like the real economic power. We're like, a little colony of China. I mean, we're sending them stuff that grows, and they're making all the stuff that, where you need factories. So they've got all the economic industrial might. All we got is a bunch of farmers. Not to belittle them, but that's just harvesting, what we've got from God. I mean, we don't have the industrial might that we once had. Because you look at what America's exports were 50, 60, 70 years ago. We were exporting manufactured goods. That dwarfed our agriculture. That's what we were giving everybody. Automobiles, refrigerators, washer dryers, television sets, cameras, all the stuff, all the quality stuff was all made here. Nobody would buy anything made in Japan, right? It was a joke. So it just shows you how much everything has switched when you just look at the terms of trade and what we produce and sell and what we have to import, our influence and eventually our military. Look, I mean, you remember the Soviet Union. I mean, think about the power that everybody assumed the Soviet Union had during the 1960s and the 1970s. I mean, they disappeared almost overnight, in the late 80s when the whole thing fell apart. But leading up to it, I mean, Soviet Union was this gigantic superpower, and then it was nothing. So
I would argue that's China today.
Well, no,
you just did a very good job of explaining China. Thank you for my argument.
We didn't buy anything from the Soviet Union. They didn't make shit. They couldn't even feed themselves. We had to loan them money to buy our wheat. We didn't have a trade deficit with the Soviet Union. They didn't make anything. I mean, the only thing
you know who we did? You know who we did have a trade deficit with? You know who we did have a trade deficit with?
Who?
And there's a lot of parallels with Japan. Japan was a manufacturing power. We had a huge real estate boom, and they were the up and coming.
We still have a deficit with Japan. But yes, the mistake that Japan made first of all, the mistake that they made during the 80s was not allowing the yen to appreciate more. They began to get concerned about the weakness of the US dollar, and so they printed too much money and they kept interest rates too low, and that really fueled the bubble in stocks and real estate. And then when it burst, instead of allowing the free market to purge the economy of all the zombie companies and reallocate resources and do the right thing, they constantly intervened, and the politicians were under pressure to do things, and all they did was harm. And of course, they continued to have this foolish policy of creating inflation. We need more inflation. We need low interest rates. And it was compounded by the fact that the US, we brought our interest rates down to zero. And so then they're like, screw, how do we get under zero? We got to go negative. I mean, they should have just allowed their economy to restructure and allowed the dollar to collapse against the yen. They should have let the yen go up. They should have allowed everything. And now, the Japanese government has a ton of debt. They borrowed all that money to prop up the U.S. economy, because they thought that somehow it would benefit their own economy.
But this is what China's doing right now? China has easy money. China has easy money policies right now. They're keeping interest rates low to prop up the banks. They've got all these cost holdings.
We agree.
So China's doing exactly what Japan did.
We have screwed up everybody. Everybody's economy is screwed up because we are the reserve currency, and we are basically, calling the tune, and everybody is dancing. But when you look beneath the surface, what countries have the productive capacity? That's the key. That's where wealth comes from. Who has the factories? Who has the infrastructure, the supply chains to produce the stuff that people want? It's not the United States. China has that a lot more than we do.
But they don't have the inputs. They have the capacity, but they don't have the inputs.
The raw materials are easy to source, and they're doing it. They're getting deals all over.
They're easy to source. They're easy to source right now, but in a scenario of war, they are not easy to source. And I think you would agree that war is inflationary for everybody.
Well, war itself isn't inflationary. It's the money they print to pay for the wars. That's inflationary. Money supply is going to go up as soon as the Fed goes right back to QE, which it's going to be doing. But credit is growing. I don't know, you're looking at money supply, but inflation is also, this expansion of credit. And credit is still available. I mean, people are borrowing like crazy. Now some of these companies, look, a firm came out, one of these big buy now and pay later places, maybe they're finding out it's buy now and pay never because the stock cratered, because people aren't, paying back the money they owe. But people have been able to access credit. I mean, credit card debt is still at a record low high. Savings are basically a record low. And so this is also fueling prices because people are able to borrow to buy stuff. So that's kind of replacing some of the decline in money supply, which won't last. The official money supply, they're going to turn those spigots on at the first sign of trouble.